Hello and welcome to another one of our remote episodes, which this week is on the topic of ERP systems. Today, we're going to discover how this class of enterprise software first came about and how companies can choose between the multitude of different options out there. So Johannes, perhaps if we could start off by maybe looking at the origins of ERP systems. So how did they first come about?
So I think ERPs originated from two driving forces in the 70s. By the way, the term ERP was only coined in the 90s last century, but what we typically refer as ERPs nowadays actually started in the 70s. And I think there were like two critical innovations. One was basically um, database systems. So computer, and obviously there was a lot of hardware progresses in that, but basically computing hardware had progressed to a point that where something that was like what we typically refer to as a relational database was actually possible. That was basically innovation number one. And the innovation number two was barcode readers. So if you combine the two, I mean, first, relational database were incredibly important, or even, they're just very, very early stage products. I mean, it was absolutely not as finalized as they are nowadays. But as soon as basically, I would say, it become clear how to organize the data in a relational forms, which is now ubiquitous, tables and columns. Basically, people started to realize that this format was just incredibly versatile and incredibly well suited to model most business activities. So you can actually represent, orders, payments, clients, suppliers, all sort of transactions. So it was incredibly well suited to just be the recipient of this AI. And why barcodes? Well, until barcode readers were invented in the 50s, so that was much earlier. But until computing hardware had progressed to a point where you could actually store and process sizable amount of data. I mean, the 70s it was still not that much, but it was already vast compared to what you can actually record and process by hand.
Okay, and you sort of touched upon it there. The name ERP didn't come until a little bit later down the line in the 90s. So ERP stands for Enterprise Resource Planning. But where did the name actually come from? Why did they sort of decide upon that?
So actually, ERP is, I would say, a misnomer. Unfortunately, his name was more like a marketing gimmick that came in the 90s. ERPs have basically nothing to do with planning. It's a better name would have been ERM, Enterprise Resource Management. So what happens is that as soon as you had, both databases and barcode readers, suddenly a lot of companies started to realize, oh, it's very, very good. I want to have I would say, a computerized system to manage all those resources. And a lot of companies started to do just that. And when I mean they started to do just that, they actually started to roll out their own software implementation of their own system, if you want, on top of the database and the various data entry devices that were available at the time. And then some other companies realized, oh, it happens that what you need to represent in many businesses are kind of the same from one business to the next. I mean, every single business needs to represent, payments. Every single business that is dealing with, I would say, a flow of physical materials need to deal with stocks. All businesses have employees on payroll. So all of that was basically as companies started to basically roll out their own, their own systems to basically just modelize their own process. Some other companies, software companies, thought, let's start to have like products that would just be like a pre-packaged version of this business modelization where you just try but first to keep track of the resources, and here was basically the whole field of what would be referred later on as ERPs was born. Although nowadays I would suggest to just think of it as ERP, not enterprise resource planning, as enterprise resource management.
Okay, you mentioned there that they were used to kind of keep track of resources, but what were the actual kind of core capabilities that those kind of early ERP systems kind of had?
So an ERP basically is the compilation of three things. It's entities, user interfaces, and basically workflow logic. So entities is just, the abstraction on top of the tables. Let's say you want to represent products, just list of products in your system. It's not you will probably have one table that is called products, but you can actually have many multiple table because maybe you have variants, maybe you have various suppliers for the products, etc. So I mean, for the people who are familiar with basically how relational databases works, they might actually realize that yes, obviously you typically need multiple tables to represent something, something that exists, a concept in business. So when I use the term entities, I mean, the high level thing like a product, a client, a transaction, as opposed to, the lower level implementation detail, which is how you actually frame this thing into an actual SQL table or tables. So you need entities that will represent all the things that exist in your company. Then you need user interfaces and a very specific type of user interfaces. I mean, most of the time they fall into a category called as known as CRUD. You know, it's actually an acronym. It stands for CRUD, so create, read, update, delete. So actually, the vast majorities when you're just dealing with entities is just crude interfaces. So you want to be able to enter a new product that would be great. You want to be able to check what is the properties and attributes of an existing products that the read. You want to modify an existing products, that's the update, and you want to delete a product. And you can repeat that for every single entity. It can be a transaction, it can be a customer, it can be etc etc etc. And so that's the second element, is that you have entities and you have the user interfaces that are built on top just to do like basic data entry work on top of every single entity. And the last thing is basically workflow logic. The idea is that let's look at something super simple like purchasing, for example. I mean, it's not that simple. It's super, I would say, ubiquitous. Um, you want to order something from a supplier. So first, you're just going to emit a purchase order. And then the supplier is going to confirm that by emitting, an invoice that you're going to receive. So maybe you want to have the purchase order in the system and maybe something like a digitalized version of the invoice that you've received. And then the supplier is going to ship goods to you. So you need to basically have something in the system that says I've received the stuff or not. So that's going to be like receivable, you know, entry in your system. And then as soon as you do receive, where the workflow logic kicks in is at first, if you don't receive anything, you should have an alert of something that you've not received anything. And then once you receive the goods, you need to have something, and again, that's going to be the workflow logic that just check that the quantities that you've just received match what you had previously ordered. If not, and it can happen, then there might be various options. One option is you suggest to actually send the thing back to the supplier. Another option is just that you will actually ping the supplier to send the rest. So bottom line, the workflow logic is like all the super mundane tasks that are just the consequence of your process that needs where the ERP can give you, a lot of, I would say, productivity improvement by just automating away all those very mundane consequences of basic business operations, such as the fact that if you receive something from a supplier, then you will have to pay the supplier, and thus you need to basically roll out this whole simple workflows. So ERPs are really doing those three things: entities, user interfaces, and workflow logic. And this is kind of it.
Okay, and sort of since those early days, ERPs have very much become sort of a dominant part of kind of the enterprise software world. But how much have they sort of changed since those kind of early pieces of software?
So what is very interesting is that to understand the change, you have to understand, the dynamics that are driving the ERPs. So especially the ERP vendors, because ERP don't nowadays they don't fall from the sky. They are not implemented by companies themselves. I mean, not frequently, but we'll get to that. And they are mostly implemented by vendors. And vendors, they very early on they adapted some strategy. Actually, successful vendors adapted basically what I typically refer to as a threefold strategy to basically win the market. And nowadays, the vast majority of successful ERP vendors are applying those three techniques. The prime challenge that you face as an ERP vendor is complexity, and thus you have to implement all those, these endless streams of entities, and for every new entity, you need a user interface, crude style, but still, and you need basically the workflow that makes sense on top of it. So the threefold solution that I was referring to is basically there are, I would say, three ways to be more competitive in this area. First is to have specific technologies that streamline the production of entities, user interfaces, and logic. And that's, by the way, exactly. And what kind of technology could you think? Well, for example, domain specific programming languages. And that's exactly what did one of the most successful ERP vendor of all time, which was so far, is SAP. SAP invented their own domain-specific programming language called ABAP as basically a tool to basically roll out faster than the competition entities, user interfaces, and logic. The second path is just to adopt the structure of your offering and your pricing. So the idea is that because as a vendor, the cost is very much, I mean, the cost to produce an ERP is very much how much it costs to implement all those stuff. This super diverse reality where piecewise, it's very simple stuff, and ERPs are not about complex, sophisticated, machine learning like logic. It's about dealing with very mundane stuff like just a receipt. How do you represent a receipt in your system? It's not rocket science, but it needs to be done. Okay, so because you have to produce and support all those entities, it becomes actually very quickly it makes sense to start charging not by entity because that would be too fine grained. You would typically end up thinking charging by modules. So you've produced hundreds, maybe thousands of entities. You're going to partition those entities into some sort of grouping that kind of makes sense business wise, and you're going to refer to them as modules.
And that kind of raises a really interesting point in terms of how the ERP systems are sort of charging out their software, and obviously there's an additional price for adding on a module. So we spoke a bit about sort of vendor lock-in previously. So where do the economic interests of all of these ERP providers kind of lie?
Yeah, I mean, as soon as you start having this module-driven way to compute, I mean, modules are very efficient because that let you, have a pricing that is vaguely aligned, at least with the what it costs as a software vendors to actually implement all those stuff. But it also, indeed, as you correctly point out, it gives you very specific incentives as well. It gives you incentives to basically go on. Um, a never-ending upsell path where as soon as you've sold something to a client, you're going to try to come up with another module and try to sell it on top. And before I get to the fine print of that, I'm maybe going to go to the last one. The third idea is that because you have like an endless stream of, you know, fine grained details about realities that you want to capture, at some point, successful ERP vendors figured out ways to basically um, go even faster through what is known nowadays as integrators. So the idea is that reality is way too complex for one company to manage everything. So at some point, you start to say, okay, um, on top of that, I'm going to use external companies to basically do the last mile feature for those clients, and it's going to be new entities, new UI, new logic, and I'm going to have like a vivid ecosystem of partners that can do that, known as integrators. And also for those ERP vendor company, it's very interesting in terms of business model because they offload the cost and risk associated to this the tail of the feature, because there is like a very long, a fat tail of I would say unfrequent features to third-party companies. So it's a rich management. The software vendors they risk their own position by offloading the risk to the integrator and obviously to their clients. And it's interesting, the integrator have also an incentive, but they have an incentive to which is slightly not which is not completely aligned with the incentive of the ERP vendor. The incentive of the integrator is to make sure that the client goes with the largest amount of customization. Why? Because they are not paid. The integrator is not really paid that much money for I would say built-in modules. They are paid a lot more for bespoke modules. And the interesting thing is that the integrator can have a very convincing message for the clients. What they can say is your business is unique. You have your unique area of competitiveness, and you need something that truly reflects, and frequently it's true to some extent, frequently it's true, you need to have something that truly reflects this unique aspect, and we are going to do that for you.
Okay. So what you've described there is there's obviously some very different approaches that companies can kind of take, and there's a lot of different complexities that kind of need to be taken into account. So how do you choose between what is a good approach and what is kind of a bad approach?
So nowadays I would say, and the problem that you have, and when you want to revisit, I would say, and make choices with regard of ERPs nowadays, is the first question that you should ask yourself is that all are those constraints that were built into ERPs as they emerged in the late 70s still relevant to my situation nowadays? And I would say, well, it really depends. It really depends from many factors. I mean, most of it, first, the idea that you need to have everything integrated into one system. I think it's nowadays it's complete nonsense, um, because um, complexity doesn't scale linearly. So you would think that, oh, we can, just add entities endlessly into the system and we are going to cover everything. But yes and no. Why? Because as you add entities, you end up with more and more edge cases. You know, for example, um, what is referred as a product um, completely varies from one. I mean, there are some. It doesn't vary completely from one company to the next, but there are areas, verticals where it really means completely different things. If you're like a digital media agency, what you call a product doesn't have anything to do with what a car manufacturer would call a product, and it doesn't have anything to do what let's say a chemical company might actually call a product as well. So that's the problem. So first, I would say revisit the assumption that um, one thing that you don't really need anymore is this idea that you will have one thing that does everything. That's probably the biggest assumption that was 100% correct in the late 70s, but that is now mostly incorrect. Though don't get me wrong, having like 100 distinct separate systems that you have to coordinate is hell. But on the other hand, having one master system that is supposed to be the alpha and omega is also hell in its own rights, because that means that when you will want to touch anything in this system, it will be like a big bang project where every single function in your company is dramatically impacted. So it becomes exceedingly difficult to roll out such kind of like I would say master systems in a way.
And then with those kind of master systems, how easy is it to then transition to kind of a new system? Because we saw in the kind of the news a couple of years ago, Lidl wasted something like 1 billion trying to transition to a new ERP system. So how easy is that to do in practice?
Yeah, it was 2009. They wasted €500 million on an SAP on upgrade. It was not even a deployment. It was just an upgrade. Um, so the thing is, and that's a very interesting question. When you want, so first, it's a rule is that it's typically more difficult to upgrade an ERP than to just move toward um, a new one. I mean, it's kind of weird, but it's kind of what I've observed. Um, because at least when you migrate toward a new one, you are under no illusion that it will be like a massive undertaking. While when you say it's just an upgrade, it might sound, simple, but actually it's going to be very, very difficult. So the problem is that you typically have from one version to the next a semantic shift in the entities. So you see, ERPs are all about, as I was describing, representing entities that represent, the various concepts that you have in your business, products, etc., etc. And you would think, oh, the semantic of something in the ERP is defined by the vendor, but it's not true. It's only partially defined by the vendor. What gives the final semantic to any entity is it's in the eye of the operator, in the eye of the person who interact with the system and basically do the data entry and do the workflow. So the true semantic lies in the eye of the person who operate the ERP. And unfortunately for the ERP vendors doesn't have much control on what people are actually doing with their product. I mean, they can obviously have recommendation and training programs, but in the end, it's very, very difficult. And again, the idea that some companies might decide to have like a slightly different semantic is not all bad. It's literally what it takes to actually get the damn ERP working in their own situation. So it's not, they don't do that just because they are like cowboys that can't abide to any rule. They do that because it's a matter of getting the ERP to work. But the problem is that when you move to the next version, you can have like tons of subtle edge cases where the entity suddenly doesn't mean exactly the same thing, and the new development that have taken place end up with myriad and myriad of various edge cases.
Okay. And at the kind of the other end of the spectrum, away from those kind of large monolithic approaches, are kind of the smaller, more specialized ERP companies. The problem is they're small companies that you don't know if they're really going to survive for perhaps the next decade, and a business might outlast all of that. So how much confidence can you place in those smaller companies?
I would say if you're a small company, indeed, you want to have a system that is where the complexity kind of makes sense with regard to your own scale. And ERPs as products, as software products, the complexity only go one way over time, toward more complexity. So the thing is, if you're like a young company, like let's say you're a 5 years old company, maybe you're very lucky, you already have 100 employees because you've been growing very fast, etc. Um, I would say if you contemplate an ERP that is like 3 decades old, maybe four, chances are that this product is just incredibly complex. Hundreds, if not thousands, of tables. Hundreds of entities and whatnot. And this complexity can completely exceed when you can, cope with. So first, I would say yes. It may sound, a bit limiting to go for a younger, company that is more risky, but beware of the risk of just burying yourself under piles of complexity. Um, I mean, in terms of risk, I have seen, you know, I don't think in over a decade now that I've run Lokad, I've ever seen a company, you know, facing absolutely dramatic situation because their ERP vendor was dead. In contrast, if you roll out a product that is one or two orders of magnitude too complex compared to your scale, that can kill you. And that I've seen it, much more frequently, where companies were almost on the verge of death due to their struggle to embrace a piece of software that was just overkill for them in terms of complexity feature wise. I mean, the feature wise is very important. It's really what can you take away, and and so my suggestion is that yes, there are risks on going for small vendors, but as far ERPs are going, um, it's better to have something, and that's the counterintuitive, I think, essence of ERPs. It's better to go for something where there are, a very good core, narrow core that kind of that core reflect your current complexity and current scale, even if this core is still missing stuff, because again, ERPs are only additive. You can only add stuff. It's very, very hard to remove anything. So if you choose a product that is kind of almost good enough, you can always kind of supplement, the missing bits with a bit of integration, and you will do just fine. On the other hand, if you have too many things and you have things that just conflict with what you do, then you're screwed. And beware, having more features is not a good thing in terms of software. I mean, usually the features that you don't use find ways to just wreak havoc in your own processes, and then you will be struggling like hell to say, oh, I want to do this simple thing, and then the vendor will tell you, but you can't because what you're trying to attempt interact with tons of other features, and you would say, oh, but I don't use those features. Why are those features that I don't even use prevent me from doing that? And the answer is, well, it's a monolith, this product. This is a fully integrated software product. So if you start doing that here, you will just wreak havoc on sorts of things, and that will bounce back on you. So that creates a problem. Obviously, it's not because you choose a smaller product that you eliminate this problem. You still have this problem, but again, the magnitude and the importance of this product is very kind of proportional to the amount of entities and complexities that you have in the software in the first place.
Okay, and we're going to have to start sort of wrapping things up a little bit today. But as a final kind of point, would you say the key message from today is if you're looking for a new ERP, you should be looking for something that's got a strong core and it has interconnected apps which you can use in order to grow your company, and you shouldn't be looking for something that is probably more complex than that at this stage?
So my message would be, I mean, depend on the scale. So let's take it on the scale. If you're small, if you're a small company, let's say less than 100 people, you want to find something that is like, I would say, narrow, simple, and cheap, typically a SaaS app. And there are plenty of SaaS apps that charge you, $50 per user per month or something, that can actually act as your ERP. And maybe you will need like two or three of those. Again, it's not the death of you if you need like two apps. One, for example, typically one to manage human resources and payroll, and one to manage the flow of physical goods. Those two things are exceedingly different. You don't need to have like one ERP to do payroll, which comes typically with tons of regulations and employment laws and whatnot, and do things like physical inventory management. So you don't need to have that. So I would suggest, if you're small, go for, two or three apps that really cover what you need, typically SaaS, because you don't want to bother with the management, etc. Just make sure that those apps have APIs so that you can get the data out ultimately, so that you can migrate out of those apps later on. So that would be my suggestion if you're like very small. If you're mid-size, let's say 500 employees, a bit more aggressive, then maybe you can consider to go for a mid-size ERP products. That's going to be a lot more complicated. You will probably have like 1,000 tables and whatnot, but that's a sort of situation where it can make sense. It can make sense because um, at this point, I mean, if you're like a 500 people company, you start having tons of very typical, I would say, things to manage and run. And ERPs can give you, this coverage of all those features that you would like to have. and you have enough money to basically pay for a good integrator and go for maybe a 2-year long project to go to the end of it. And that can give you something that is more productive compared to small apps that are starting to show their limits. Then if you're bigger, then I would say the situation change again. If you're bigger, more, I mean, let's say you're like a 5,000 employee, you're a large company, then typically I would say there are two things that really kicks in. First, you want to break the monolith. The monolith is just not going to work for you. You're large. If you go for like a monolithic ERP, which most large companies are doing, I would say most, I mean, it's going to be ugly. It's going to take years. It's going to be incredibly costly. If you look at what the very best large companies are doing, they are typically rolling out, I would say, fairly bespoke stuff. And there are very good reason. If you're large companies, chances are that you have like some unique competitive edge that are not like a simple thing. They are like it's like embedded in your organization, which is large, which is complex, and maybe you had like acquisition, so you might have like an heterogeneous landscape in the first place. So instead of saying I want one ERP to rule it all, that was working when you had like 500 employees. It becomes like very difficult when you are like 5,000 employees. So my suggestion is you need to basically divide and conquer. This sort of approach that I was suggesting when you were very small, and you had like a couple of apps, you can revisit that in a completely different way if you're large to say I'm going to split the landscape into, I don't know, maybe up to a dozen of functional areas, and then I'm going to build or buy on every area depending on whether the vendors that I can find are basically are good or not. And the biggest challenge, what I would recommend to those larger companies, is to basically break the dogma that you need to have like one ERP to rule them all. I believe that is mostly, I mean, it's mostly nonsense. And if you look at very, very super competitive players, let's say Amazon, let's look at Alibaba, let's look at Rakuten, let's look at Zalando, those tech players who have to deal with a physical supply chain. So I'm not speaking about Microsoft, who is like a pure, almost, it's not completely a pure digital players. They have Xbox. The Xbox is a very physical product, but if you look at companies who have been recognized as being at the top of their game to manage a physical supply chain like Amazon, they all went for a very, I would say, divide and conquer approach in their applicative landscape, where basically they go very aggressively for build or buy approach, and basically they don't. None of those companies have really an ERP. They have list of products. Some of them would be closer to an ERP, and most of those companies have actually rolled their own systems as well, for specific parts of what would be referred typically as an ERP module.
Brilliant. Well, we're going to have to wrap it up there, but thanks very much for your time this morning.
Thank you, Kiran.
So that's everything for this week. Thanks very much for tuning in, and we'll see you again in the next episode. Bye for now.